Big Bang.
The musical landscape of Western Europe was transformed irreversibly a few centuries ago by a unique evolutionary development. Much of the world's most beautiful music couldn't exist without it, and yet others claim that it has sterilized the very roots that our music grew from. I'm talking about something called equal temperament. You may never have heard of it, but equal temperament is one of man's most audacious attempts to tame the elemental force of nature. Man's relationship with music is rooted in nature and goes back over 40,000 years to the time when our cave-dwelling ancestors first began making musical sound. Gradually, man started to create a musical scale by arranging notes into some kind of natural pattern. This man is playing the bamboo flute, a traditional Chinese instrument that has remained unchanged for thousands of years. All the notes he's using are derived from nature. The sound is undoubtedly exquisite, but it's very different from this. Using nature's simplest pattern of notes, it's impossible to create a big orchestral sound like this. So Western musicians have tampered with the natural structure of music to create our own man-made tuning system. For the last 300 years at least, big-name composers have been able to make big-scale music thanks to the Big Bang of equal temperament. The implications of this particular Big Bang affect every single piece of music we listen to. As Western man tried to restructure time through the calendar and the clock, so through equal temperament, we have taken the music that nature gave us and manipulated it artificially. Every note of our musical repertoire is a monstrous compromise. The road from the raw sounds of nature to the artificial smoothness of equal temperament is long and tortuous and stretches right back to ancient Greece, where musicians first became intrigued by the idea of a ladder or scale of notes. And believe it or not, the clever dick who came up with this configuration of notes was a certain Mr. Pythagoras, the same man who brought us the mathematics of triangles. Music was extremely popular in ancient Greece, as it had been in the Egypt of the pharaohs, but as far as we know, its shape and structure was somewhat haphazard. Pythagoras' goal was to give order to the musical free-for-all he heard at every all-night toga party and bacchanalian rave.
What Pythagoras discovered was that, rather like the way that architecture relies on perfect proportions to make a pleasing structure, musical notes also worked harmoniously together when they had a simple mathematical relationship.
His discovery, according to legend, happened quite by accident. So the story goes, he was walking past a blacksmith's when he heard a harmonious chord of chimes coming from the sound of hammer on anvil.
The harmony of the chimes sounded so perfect to Pythagoras that he rushed in to find out more. When he weighed the hammers that were making the sounds, he discovered that they were simple ratios of each other. One was half the size of the first, another was 2/3 the size, and so on. What Pythagoras was actually hearing was a demonstration of natural harmonics.
Now, if you take a piece of metal and strike it, it makes a note. It's a simple note, but with many other notes in its overtones, or harmonics, rather in the way that light is made up of a spectrum of different colours. Just because you can't see them with the naked eye doesn't mean to say they're not there.
If you listen to the metal bar's note, in the resonance of the sound you might be able to hear various higher versions of the same note. If notes were colours, you could call this note red, and its higher version light red.
These higher versions are what we now call octaves, and they're all there contained within the original note, whether you like it or not. That's nature for you. Now, if you take a piece of metal exactly half the size of the original, it will produce as its main note that light red. And if you play the two together, they make a sound almost like one note. An octave, therefore, is a totally natural distance between notes. This is the same sound, only a higher version of that. But if you strike a piece of metal exactly 2/3 the size of the original, you actually create a new note. Call it yellow. And believe it or not, this new note is also contained in the overtones or harmonics of the original. And that's because 2/3 is a naturally harmonious ratio in maths. It was this creation of new notes from the relationship of 2/3 that caught Pythagoras' imagination.
In his time, Pythagoras was as famous for being a mystic as a mathematician. He believed that the universe had its own music, a harmony created by the movement of the planets in relation to each other. The cosmos was to him one vast harmonic ratio made out of lots of smaller ratios which together formed a harmonious musical universe. Just as the sea's tides were affected by the moon's relationship to Earth, so everything on Earth was affected by the movement of the spheres. To Pythagoras, music was the link between man and the cosmos. He even went so far as to claim that he could hear the music of the spheres and used to sing the tunes to his disciples. Since music came, he believed, from the heavens, it would be at its most powerful and mystical when obeying the natural laws of physics. So he set to work creating a scale of notes by dividing metal into simple ratios in what we can only imagine to have been some sort of musical laboratory. Pythagoras' teaching on the natural science of notes had a profound influence on early Western music. If you've ever wondered why we have our particular set of notes to play with, well, they were chosen first by Pythagoras. And he found them by dividing pieces of metal by 2/3. If you carry on dividing by 2/3 again and again, you create an infinite sequence or spiral of notes. Now, it's quite hard to visualize Pythagoras' endless cycle of notes, so we're going to build a spiral to show how it works, with these colored tiles representing the notes. The first note, red, is easy because that was the note we made from our original metal bar. And that's the foundation or the base of our spiral. By dividing that first piece of metal by 2/3, we were able to create a perfectly tuned new note. Call it yellow. And that goes in a bit higher up. The pitch of the sound dictates its exact position in the spiral. By dividing yellow by 2/3, we can create a third note, higher still and further round, and so on and so forth into an infinite spiral of new notes. The mathematical distance between them makes a rather satisfying shape. With the 12th note in position, you can see from above a pattern emerging with the notes roughly spaced around the circle of the octave. But when you get to the 13th note, it all goes horribly wrong, which I can show you if I collapse the model. Because the 13th note wants to shove the first note out of the way. This battle to occupy the same space creates a terrible and upsetting dissonance and is the result of something known as the Pythagorean comma. Pythagoras' solution was simple and ruthless: to do away with the notes of third and upwards altogether. But the problem of the dreaded comma was even graver than Pythagoras had imagined. It didn't just affect the 13th note, but the distance between every note in the octave. The distance between two notes is determined by tuning. To tune a note is to adjust that distance. For all the notes to work perfectly together, they would need to be tuned so they were exactly equally spaced, like the dials on a clock face. As it was, the comma shifted each note a little off-center, producing a slightly uneven pattern, which got progressively worse with each step of the spiral. To begin with, musicians played extra safe by using only the first 7 notes of the spiral, which, together with the original, made up the basic 8-note scale from which the word octave derives. From the ancient Greeks right through to the Middle Ages, European music made do with the 8-step version of this Pythagorean scale. One way of keeping the troublesome comma at bay was to keep music as simple as possible, which is more or less what they did. Even as late as the 13th century, musicians were sticking to notes derived from the first few steps of the spiral, which they arranged into basic tunes playing just one note at a time.
In any case, much of it was popular music, made by bands of bawdy buskers thrashing out simple but joyous tunes to the rhythm of a merry drum. More ambitious composers, though, working for the church, felt that it could be more than just catchy riffs and a repetitive dance beat. God's house music had a more serious subtext and would therefore require a sophisticated approach.
Church scholars started to look for ways to make it sound as glorious as possible, to raise it above the rabble of the secular world and worthy of the exaltation of God. One way was to give music texture by adding new musical lines to an existing melody. The idea was that the combination of notes might create sweet-sounding harmonies, the sound of angels. By combining notes, though, these musical monks were asking for trouble. Sooner or later, Pythagoras' naughty comma would raise its ugly head again.
The problem was that unfortunately many of the notes created from the Pythagorean system sounded rather strange when played together. These two notes, the first and the fifth, sounded fine. That's because they were a perfect harmony, the ones we created from our 2/3 metal ratio. Likewise, the fourth sounded fine. That was a perfect ratio. But the third was derived from much further up the spiral of notes,
where the effect of the dreaded comma had shifted it out of kilter with the foundation note.
And so, to medieval ears, it sounded rather unpalatable when combined with it. The same was true of the sixth note. So musicians tended to avoid thirds and sixths altogether and just stick to basic tunes with fifths and fourths for harmony.
Gaudete, gaudete, Christus est natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.
The reason why medieval music sounds to us rather austere and barren is because of the lack of the warm harmonies that thirds and sixths gave to later music. But the point of sacred music was to be more than just a pleasing sound. It was supposed to mirror the perfection of God's creation, and so it couldn't be hampered with lightly. To medieval ears, the note combinations that were derived from impure ratios felt unnatural and unwholesome, so the church all but prohibited their use. To break the rules by experimenting with chords including thirds or sixths was tantamount to heresy.
To show you what they were missing out on, here's a simple example. Listen to this tune, which could have been written in medieval times.
But add modern harmonies and it's transformed into something medieval composers couldn't even hear in their dreams. To make the journey from medieval simplicity to rich, chocolatey harmony would mean playing around with Pythagorean tuning and interfering with the laws of nature. Happily for us, temptation proved just too much for some religious composers. In the 15th century, they tasted harmony's forbidden fruit and never looked back. European music was still being made from the scale of notes created by Pythagoras as late as 2,000 years after his death. But then along came a dreamer with other ideas.
Amazingly, it was an Englishman in the early 15th century who first started to rock the boat and whose note combinations first dared challenge the Pythagorean norm. This Englishman was a composer with a particular fascination for all things astrological.
Surprisingly little is known about John Dunstable. We don't even know what he looked like, but his only surviving manuscript contains drawings of the constellations, hinting that here was a man, like Pythagoras, with a keen interest in the link between music and the stars.
Although John Dunstable's life is shrouded in mystery, there's no confusion about the importance of his work. In fact, it's no exaggeration to say that he was the most influential English composer in Europe before the Beatles. Imagine.
Like most medieval composers, Dunstable wrote mostly church music, but unlike all other composers, he started to break the rules. Not content with the simple fourths and fifths that other composers used, Dunstable started to experiment with those saucy and impure thirds and sixths that had hitherto been so frowned upon by religious musical theorists. To To make these new harmonies work, he kept well away from keyboards, whose tuning was already fixed and inflexible. He experimented instead with the wonderfully flexible tones of the human voice.
What singers are able to do is to retune their voices every time they hit a third or a sixth. It'd be like a guitarist twiddling the pegs on the neck of their instrument hundreds of times during a single performance.
Dunstable used the supple tool of the voice to retune thirds and sixths, and found that they brought new light and colour to the basic melody. Before long, his compositions were riddled with these radical new sounds.
Dunstable showed off his strange and sweet new harmonies in a series of sacred choral works. One of these, Veni Sancte Spiritus, was first performed at a special service held here in Canterbury Cathedral in 1416. The occasion was a Thanksgiving Mass for the English military victory at Agincourt in the presence of Henry V himself.
In his time, Dunstable's music must have sounded incredibly avant-garde and modern. He was taking brazen liberties with the rhythm as well as the harmony of the period. He didn't think of himself as a revolutionary, but with the benefit of hindsight, we can see what an effect he had. His music is the first sign of a sea change in composers' attitude to harmony. Nature was being left behind and replaced with something much more man-made and seductive. None of this radical rule-breaking would have added up to much if Dunstable had stayed in backwater England. As it was, military matters had a hand in changing the course of musical history. After the success of Agincourt, Dunstable travelled to northern France as court composer to the victorious English. They were to remain in France until the conclusion of the 100 Years' War. With Dunstable went all his fancy new harmonies, which were to capture the imagination of his continental counterparts.
The occupying English forces were garrisoned here along the Loire under the control of the Duke of Bedford, the king's brother. Bedford made two rather contrasting contributions to history. One was to have the good sense and taste to hire John Dunstable as his court composer. The other, rather less intelligent idea was to have Joan of Arc burnt at the stake.
What Dunstable made of his boss's grim campaign against the Maid of Orleans is unclear. What we do know is that Dunstable's music was thought by continental composers to be exceptional. Indeed, the great French composers of the day were quick to imitate his daring style and harmonic technique. The thirds and sixths he had pioneered became commonplace. The course of musical history veered off into uncharted waters.
Thanks to risk-takers like Dunstable and his continental counterparts, music moved out of the stagnant Dark Ages and into the colour and warmth of the Renaissance.
The hub of the Renaissance was northern Italy, where for the first time since Pythagoras, society started to look again with renewed interest at the valuable relationship between mathematics and the arts.
While artists were still grappling with the new concept of perspective in art, composers were increasingly intrigued by the notion that depth could be given to music by the combining of notes in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways.
Three-part harmonies grew to 4 and beyond. Voices, of course, could bend the tuning of the notes to make the new harmonies work. But the use of an accompanying keyboard meant that the tuning of instruments had to be specially adjusted to cope with the plethora of new chords and harmonies. Science and the arts were transformed during the Renaissance by a craze for invention and experimentation. While scientists like Galileo were busy throwing cannonballs off the Leaning Tower of Pisa, composers were throwing all sorts of sounds together in ever more ambitious compositions. All this experiment and abundance had a downside. Pythagoras' original 12-note scale was beginning to fall apart at the seams under the strain of all the new sounds. The problem the old Greek philosopher had chosen to ignore, the dreaded comma, had come back to life with a vengeance.
To clarify just how serious a problem this so-called comma was, we need to understand the mystery of keys. And to do that, I think I'll need a drink. Say, for example, I wanted to create a scale from a single note, the Pythagorean way. Now, this wine glass, for example, is more or less a G. Now, like different lengths of metal, different levels of wine in the glass will change the notes. So if I sip a little, it should now go higher, as indeed will I. Ah, you see now it's an A flat. And if I pour more in, it should go lower again. Ah, here I see another G. Now, from this mother G, I can create a whole family of notes, which is called a key. So this is my key or family of G. Now, if I were to take one of the notes belonging to the family of G, say C, I could create from it a whole new family of notes. The key of C, completely different from the key of G. Indeed, all notes give birth to their own particular family or key.
The problem, thanks to the disruptive influence of the comma, is that very few keys or families worked successfully together in the same piece of music.
Now, up to the late Renaissance, practically all music was written in one key or another. You didn't move between them. So all instruments were carefully tuned, like these glasses, to play a particular piece in a particular key. So far, so good. But then composers started to get greedy and asked, why can't we have more than one key in a piece, or 2, or 3, or 4? And the net result was to make tuning an absolute nightmare.
The process was called tempering. A tuning system created by tempering was called a temperament. Every Tom, Dick and Heinrich across Europe had his own temperament. Chaos reigned. Notes were being pulled this way and that to accommodate the different needs of different keys. The trouble was, a tuning that worked for one piece of music sounded wrong in another. Putting instruments with different tunings together in the same piece of music was increasingly problematical. By trying manfully to cope with all the extra notes composers wanted, keyboard tuners ended up with some hideously deformed and mutated note relationships. These were known as wolf tones on account of the grim and unsavory howling of their dissonance. Lurking behind all this tempering, tuning and wolfing about lay a simple, terrifying truth waiting to be unearthed. This was the concept of an equal temperament. That is, a tuning system that divided up the octave artificially into 12 exactly equal parts. Instead of having 12 different keys with their own individual patterns of notes, like cogs belonging to different wheels that can't interlock, the idea of an equal temperament was to create a single mathematical pattern of notes. This would become the blueprint for all the keys, so they could fit together in the same piece of music. The question was, how could musicians who tuned their instrument by ear create a mathematically perfect scale? For a while, it seemed an impossible dream. But then, out of the blue, a genius burst abruptly onto the scene and changed musical history once and for all with a composition. The Big Bang actually occurred in this castle in eastern Germany, and the man behind it was none other than Johann Sebastian Bach. By the beginning of the 18th century, keyboard tuners all over Europe were struggling, through trial and error, to find a temperament that would allow musicians to play in a variety of different keys on a single keyboard. But Bach laid down an even bigger challenge, to find a tuning system that could handle all the keys. No ifs, no buts. In his day, Bach was one of the most celebrated and revered keyboard players in Europe. His influence as a teacher was considerable, so it's probably apt that the court of Anhalt-Köthen, where he worked for a while, is now a music school. Whilst in the service of Count Leopold here in 1722, Bach produced what must be the single most important collection of keyboard pieces ever written, the 48 Preludes and Fugues, known collectively as the Well-Tempered Keyboard. Every piece of history relies on good timing and a little luck. The chances are that had Bach not landed this relatively cushy post at Curtin, the 48 Preludes and Fugues would never have been written. As it was, Bach found himself in the employ of a wealthy 23-year-old count who happened to be a great lover of secular music. Despite being Kapellmeister, Bach had no actual chapel duties, so there was plenty of time to concentrate on challenges and exercises for all his harpsichord pupils, of which his 48 Preludes and Fugues was the most spectacular. The crucial thing about this collection of tunes is that it contains pieces in all the keys of the keyboard. Yes, indeed. The moment it became circulated, everyone knew that Bach had somehow found the lost city of El Dorado, that he alone seemed to have cracked the mystery of temperaments.
Because what this book means is that a keyboard had at last been tuned that could let you play all the keys at one sitting. This modest book turned out to be a mightily big bang.
No one knows exactly whether it was Bach himself or a colleague who initially cracked the code and found a way of tuning the keyboard to play all these pieces for the first time. No doubt it was a lengthy process of trial and error which resulted in this near-perfect compromise. What we do know is that the system was perfected and written up a few years later for all the world to see by Bach's star pupil Johann Philipp Kirnberger. Once the 48 preludes and fugues became known, all composers and tuners knew the game was up. It could, after all, be done. You could have a keyboard that accommodated all the keys and scales together harmoniously. A single tuning system that could play all the keys did for music what the supermarket did for shopping, for better or worse. Instead of shopping around in all these small stores, you could find everything under one roof. Instead of specially tuning your instrument for each individual key, you could find them all on one keyboard. Love it or loathe it, the well-tempered keyboard was here to stay. Bach himself moved to a more prestigious job as music director of the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig not long after he wrote his groundbreaking preludes and fugues in all 12 keys. Leipzig then, as now, was a major trading and cultural centre. Within 50 years, Bach's keyboard works had been published Europe-wide. The well-tempered keyboard had become a universal fact of life. The arrival of the well-tempered keyboard was a critical turning point in the history of European music. Without it, the complex works of great composers like Mozart and Beethoven, Brahms and Tchaikovsky could never have been written. It gave all composers the ability to move easily from key to key, to indulge themselves with previously remote and inaccessible families of sounds. It's no exaggeration to say that the well-tempered system revolutionized classical music all over Western Europe. But it would take another revolution altogether to ensure that it spread to every corner of the globe.
If Bach's preludes and fugues launched the idea of a successfully tempered keyboard, it was something else altogether that made it technically possible and universally available: Victorian engineering.
Thanks to new technology, machines could be manufactured with absolute accuracy. Holes could be bored in exact places, tension fine-tuned with the fraction of a turn. This was the era of precision engineering, which radically affected all aspects of life. The tuning system of Bach's time, which had been devised through trial and error, could at last be implemented using mathematics. The formula for equal temperament produced a fiendishly precise figure, the 12th root of 2, which could now be applied with accuracy and ease. Keyboards and other instruments could be mass-produced with the help of machines. Pianos were given huge iron frames, allowing metal strings of incredible tension to be held taut and stable. The holes in oboes, clarinets, and bassoons could be bored with minute exactness. The age of a truly equal temperament had arrived. From about the 1830s onwards, all fact-made instruments conformed to this new mathematical standard. Once the instruments were mass-produced, they could be exported all over the world. The global invasion of equal temperament had begun. This innocuous, seemingly harmless instrument was one of the most devastatingly effective weapons in the triumph of equal temperament. The accordion, invented in 1830 and mass-produced towards the end of the 19th century, was extremely portable, and it had two other important characteristics. First, it was fixed stubbornly to the equal temperament system. The name accordion actually means tuned. And secondly, it was loud. The accordion spread through Europe like wildfire, with its promise of a fuller sound than its ability to play melody and accompaniment simultaneously. It took with it the regimented norm of equal temperament, forcing all other instruments to conform to its rigid dictates. In countries where ethnic and folk music were more prevalent than classical music, the arrival of the accordion was to have a particularly insidious effect. As the 20th century dawned, accordions were brought into more and more remote cultures on the fringe of Europe, like here in Romania. They came ready-tuned, of course, to equal temperament. Because it was louder than anything else around, it forced the other, older and quieter instruments to adapt themselves to its tuning. By so doing, the more ancient ethnic tuning systems were unwittingly signing their own death warrants. Before the age of amplifiers and PAs, the accordion was perfect for accompanying dancing because of its strong, rhythmic sound. It was, frankly, irresistible to folk bands like this gypsy wedding ensemble. As the accordion was introduced in the early 20th century, the old harmonies and chords of Romany music were replaced with the equalized, compatible key system that Bach had so successfully exploited. This gypsy music doesn't need to change key all the time, yet it's now restricted by the same tuning system that was essential to a composer like Beethoven. A common criticism of equal temperament is that it has drowned out its rivals with all their wonderful, exotic idiosyncrasies. Actually, though, what we're witnessing in this Romanian music is a marriage of ancient Eastern flavours with the newer Western harmonies. The strings are hanging on to the ornaments and phrases of the old and wild, whilst the chords in the accompaniment are the newer, regulated Western style. It may be a shotgun marriage brought about by accident of history, but the tension between the two produces an exciting mishmash, a hurly-burly of sound. If this music sounds out of tune to you, it's because the norm of equal temperament is so all-pervasive and powerful that you too are listening with the filter of Western tuning in your head. The world used to be chock-a-block with other alternative temperaments. Now it's overwhelmingly dominated by just one. Folk culture is receding everywhere. Even traditional weddings like this amongst Romanian gypsies are becoming a thing of the past. But while equal temperament has steamrolled its way across most of the globe, flattening all other tuning systems in its path, there's still one culture that stubbornly continues to offer an alternative to it. This culture has made a deliberate decision to reject the seductive promises of the man-made system in favor of natural simplicity. The Chinese had also figured out the science of equal temperament, the magic formula of the 12th root of 2. But unlike the West, they weren't interested in a mathematical fudge. They still considered the relationship between music and nature to be sacrosanct. Like Pythagoras, the Chinese still believe in the strong link between music and the cosmos. Drawing from the same scale that Pythagoras used back in ancient Greece, they work mainly with the first 5 notes of the series, which is known as the pentatonic scale. Traditional Chinese music has none of the nervous tension of our highly strung Western tuning system. Instead, it has a tranquility and natural stillness to it that makes it much more suited to meditation than the pulsating, vibrating music so prevalent in the West. But even here, the rot is beginning to set in. Young people in China are becoming more and more exposed to Western tuning, and gradually their own ancient musical style is starting to sound out of tune. In the next 20 or so years, this last stronghold of the non-Western sound will, it seems, inevitably begin the process of retuning itself to the louder, more insistent voice of equally tempered music. There's no doubt that in the long struggle for an equal temperament, we in the West have lost a connection with the natural world. From Pythagoras to Dunstable, from J.S. Bach to Stevie Wonder, we have deliberately turned our back on nature and forged a man-made compromise. We're now living in a musical environment utterly dominated by the artificial tuning of equal temperament. So much European music is so exquisitely beautiful it's impossible to imagine a world without it. Most music written since Bach's time actually needs equal temperament for it to function properly. I, for one, believe the rewards of equal temperament far outweigh its flaws. I can even think of individual pieces that justify its invention on their own. This is one of them.